Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Cascadia Network's presentation at the Victory Farm Center for the Humanities. This is probably one of our this is like our sixth salon that we've done so far, and it's what we're really excited about because it's an opportunity. These events are an opportunity for people to share their intellectual and creative work, and this will be the first thing like this that Bert's really been able to do for a more general audience, though he's done some presentations and other capacities because Bert's been a part of, I think, all of our seminars, except for the STET one right now, but like he's been a part of all of our seminars for like the last year. And actually, some of us met Bert like 2.5 years ago in a club where a lot of us were kind of initially developing and talking about a lot of the ideas that kind of have evolved into where we currently are now. So I guess the reason we wanted Bert to talk about or to teach us a little bit about what he knows about the Russian Revolution came from when we went to a Dead Parrot Society group. It's a group that meets out in Nampa, Idaho. It's a philosophy club that meets once a month. And I mean, they talk about all sorts of things, but that specific meeting, I think it was on Marx. And so you just brought so much to the conversation, as you always do. But I mean, the historical anecdotes were all, well, a lot of them, or almost all of them, were new to me, I think, Brian. So yeah. Anyway, this is Bert. If you don't know him, we love Bert. So
one of our favorites, we'll say it.
One of our favorites, we'll say it. And so it's really great to have you, and we're so happy about all the work you've put into this. And now I've just overhyped it, and so now it's going to be ruined. I'm just kidding. So this will probably be about 45 minutes long. Feel free to go within 45 minutes to an hour. We'll have time for Q&A. We might do that outside if it gets too hot in here. We'll see. So bear with us, and everybody, please help welcome Bert. So thank you. Thank you.
Hold on just a little while longer. Hold on just a little while longer. Hold on just a little while longer. Everything will be all right. Fight on just a little while longer. Fight on just a little while longer. Fight on just a little while longer. Everything will be all right. Everything will be all right. I want to understand you. I study your obscure language. My whole life has been pledged to this meeting with you. If you only knew the flames inside me that I try to beat down with my reason, more dear to me than a host of base truths is an illusion that exalts. I was not born to amuse the czars. Alexander Pushkin, the great father of Russian literature. And I started with a modern rendition, haltingly because I'm quite nervous, of an old African-American spiritual, because of the connection between the slavery on which this country was founded and the slavery that was endemic to the Russian Empire. This is something that, in a different guise, that these two nations have in common. And given that this is a nation that was founded upon the genocide of its original inhabitants, And there's just no other way around it. Cultural, physical genocide. And on the slavery of Africans brought here against their will. It's real easy to look on Russia and go, God, they suck. We are so much better than we have a moral high ground. And I'm hoping that today we can kind of defamiliarize that usual response. I became a socialist 50 years ago, sitting in a small town library, Eckhart Public Library in Auburn, Indiana. And I was reading a book about Eugene V. Debs. And I realized, wow, this is for me. But then I had this whole issue of having to live down the Russian Revolution, live down the USSR. Being brought up in America at that time, of course, this is kind of natural. But at the same time, the face of the revolution you see are these gray flannel bureaucrats. That just didn't seem like my thing. And how did they get there? And why did a revolution happen at all? And I've been struggling with that for a long time. And I think it's a good thing to try to leave our judgmentalism aside and imagine what it would be like to be the people that were living under these amazing and usually intolerable circumstances. It's real easy to poo-poo revolutions because the results are usually violent. That kind of cuts a sweet deal with the existing social order that's always based upon violence. Our social orders are, look at this one, there are a gigantic fraction of the American people in prison. A greater fraction than anyone and anywhere else in the world. That's violence. And there's also the constant threat of violence if you step out of place, if you don't watch your step. And the idea that this is a wonderful situation because people are cowered into submission, and that when they break free from that, they have to use force against their oppressors. It's really a disingenuous way of looking at things. So, not to minimize the cruelties of revolutions, which are internal wars, not at all, but to try to put it into a perspective. So, what I want to do today is explain how could a country that is, it's like two North Americas put together, covering 1/6 of the land mass of this entire planet, 6,600 miles wide, covering 11 time zones, 1/6 of the world's surface. You know, if I was going to Hollywood and had a movie script and told them there's going to be this revolution that's covering this area this big, they'd go, bullshit. That's impossible. This really happened. And it's, and there's a reason that it happened. And I'm hoping that we can put ourselves in the shoes of the people who lived under the Tsarist autocracy. Because it was not the Knights of the Round Table. It was not Frozen. It was a brutal, absolutist dictatorship that transcended what at least everybody else in the West knew. I have a quote I'd like to read to you here from an early, like an 1830s critic. It is one of the most deplorable traits of our strange civilization that we are still discovering truths that are commonplace, even among peoples much less advanced than we. This is because we have never moved in concert with the other peoples. We are not a part of any of the great families of the human race. We are neither of the West nor of the East. And we have not the traditions of either. We stand, as it were, outside of time. The universal education of mankind has not touched us. And then one more here. And this is by Peter Chadayev, who, of course, got in a lot of trouble for writing these things in 1831 in his philosophical letters. Our history began in barbarity and backwardness, followed by brutal, humiliating foreign oppression whose values were imbibed by our own rulers. Cut off by our extraordinary destiny from the rest of humanity, we failed to acquire the universal values of duty, justice, and the rule of law. When we finally threw off the Mongol yoke, the new ideas that had blossomed in Western Europe did not penetrate our state of oppression and slavery because we were isolated from the human race. We fell into a condition of ever deeper servitude. While the whole world was being rebuilt and renewed, nothing was built in Russia. Nothing of what was happening in Europe got as far as this. We have remained cowed and cowering in our miserable hovels. Perhaps you find me bitter in speaking thus of our country, but I have spoken only a small part of the whole unpalatable truth. And this point of view of the Russian inheritance became less and less radical fringe. It became a common currency among people living in the Russian Empire because people were treated like children. When Pushkin says, I was not born to amuse the czars, you existed because they allowed you to exist. And this was a system that was not going to go away. And I'm going to show how it wouldn't go away and how it worked. For instance, in the year 1600, there was in Peru, there was a volcano. And the climatic events were felt most fiercely in Russia. For 2 summers, the temperature rarely got above freezing during the day. 40% of the population died. And at the same time, English diplomats came to the court, the Russian court in Moscow. Well, yeah, it would have been Moscow at that time. And said they couldn't believe what they saw. It was the most polite, in the midst of this immense suffering. Can you imagine what it's like that your children die, your parents die, everybody you know dies over a 2-year period, and then you have the plague going on. In the Russian court, everybody was wearing furs. And not just furs, but everybody was spangled with diamonds, head to toe. The English just couldn't believe it. Precious gems. The women were heavily rouged, and they dyed their teeth black and lacquered them. And it was just so surreal. And so there was this incredible opulence that was purchased at the cost of such immense suffering, because the nobility, which was completely... In other European countries, there was a tension between the crown and the nobility. In Russia, the nobility was under the thumb of the Tsar. So in other societies where, like in England, they had to have the Magna Carta because some of the nobles had to have some rights against the crown. You didn't have anything like that. So the system was annihilating people. And One thing I'd like to tell you about here is a story about when Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812. This really kind of punctuates where the rest of the story is going to go. In 1812, Emperor Napoleon of France invaded Russia in the spring, I think. And the idea was to drive a stake through the heart of the Tsarist autocracy and create the kind of world that France and its kind of institutions could flourish. And, the Tsarist armies were welcomed some places, especially by intellectuals. I remember Hegel in 1807, was it? In Jena or whatever, where when he saw Napoleon on a horse, he was happy. It meant that something, a world historic change was taking place. Well, it wasn't experienced like that in Russia. Napoleon's forces kept trying to beat the Russian army, and the Russian army would just run away, and they would scorch the earth wherever they had been. So Napoleon's forces could not replenish their supplies. Finally, it was getting pretty late in the year. They had only one major skirmish, and they had beat the Russians pretty well, but it wasn't really a final victory. Some of Napoleon's advisors and other generals said, we should just wrap this thing up. He had an army of 500,000 people. This is insane. And he goes, no, we're going into Moscow. They have to defend Moscow. And we will have ended the Tsarist autocracy. And we made the world safe for us. Well, they got to Moscow, and the army was not there. It had fled. The city of Moscow, this jewel was empty. A few fires started. And then it turned out that the Tsarist autocracy had ordered the city burned. All these palaces, the libraries. It was mostly made out of wood at that time. They burned their own city down. And I got to read what one of Napoleon's generals wrote, because it's quite amazing here. While our soldiers were still contending with the fire, its flames so noble a prey, Napoleon, whose sleep no one had dared disturb during the night, was awakened by the double light of day and this searing holocaust. Vexed, yet determined to master it, he turned bent before the catastrophe. Surprised after striking at the heart of an empire, to find it exhibit anything other than submission or terror, he felt himself conquered and surpassed. This mighty conquest that he'd sacrificed everything for was now a phantom. He was in a state of agitation and marched back and forth in his apartments, rushing to the windows to trace the progress of the flames. And then exasperation shouted, "What a horrid spectacle! All these palaces ablaze! What character! What resolution! What a people! They really are Scythians." And Scythians were nomadic warriors who were really scary people, unpredictable, according to someone like Napoleon. So this was a nation where at least its leaders were willing to destroy everything, not to be defeated. And it was completely incomprehensible to Napoleon that someone could do that. The oldest manuscript of Russian literature, the Song of Igor, was destroyed in this fire. And this is a revered seminal, the revered seminal document of Russian society. They were willing to burn everything. Now, what's interesting about this is that Napoleon realizes he's defeated. By the time he leaves, he's lost 300,000 troops, and this is the beginning of the end of Napoleon. 2 years later, Russian troops had chased Napoleon back to Paris, and they are marching down the Champs-Élysées. You know, there's this saying, once you've been to Paris, you can't go back to the farm. Imagine what these people saw when they were marching through Paris. And not just the peasants, the serfs and stuff that made up the bulk of Napoleon's army, but the educated aristocratic classes who could not imagine how pathetic their lives were compared to France. They marched down those streets and they had to feel, oh my God, we were on the wrong side. We were actually being liberated. This is the kind of world we want. And those soldiers in 1814, there was still a lot of interchange between the educated elements in Russia. But this is one of those times there was this brush with the other world, that they brought this back home. And this created profound ferment and dissatisfaction, because the nobility, which is like 10% of the population, suddenly realized, oh my God, we're living in hovels, just like the quote I read you. And there was an initial revolt in 1825 when Bazaars died, and there was a succession crisis. 3,000 military officers tried to have a revolution from above, which didn't succeed, ended in lots of executions and imprisonments. But this was one of the beginning shots in this period of Russian history, that they realized no matter how well they had it, even the most elite realized that it was a pittance compared to the rest of the world. And this feeling of being a backward nation, there's like three things that I think we can use to break open this our understanding here of Russia. We really want to figure out how they got to this point. First of all, there's the backwardness. And this has been a big issue, that how do you deal with it? The various czarist autocracies, these weren't dumb people. They weren't innately cruel. They weren't innately insensitive. But they realized that compared to everything to the east of them, they were profoundly deficient, and just for the sake of survival, let alone pride, they had to catch up. So you have the backwardness issue that they had to deal with. You had Tsarism trying to implement it, but it couldn't. You couldn't challenge the backwardness of the society when the very way of governing it was a big aspect of its backwardness. So you were destined to fail. So there's this line of failures of Tsarist autocracy trying to modernize that we can talk about here, and how it failed. And this whole thing of trying to catch up was a big issue in the Russian Revolution, and after the October Communist Revolution and the development of Soviet socialism. A lot of it was predicated upon the objective condition of having to catch up. This is a huge deal. And another thing is there's always a social force that has to mediate the gap. The gap, all of us in our lives have gaps. Like there's a gap between who I am and who I think I really am. There's a gap between me and you, between me and God. There always seems to be something missing. There's this space. And one of the ways that this gap was negotiated in Russia was through the Russian Orthodox Church. And it's really easy just to, nag on the Russian Orthodox Church, but it served this profound function of making life understandable intolerable, and at the same time maintaining the conditions that made it intolerable. It was not all one thing. And this mediating, you have the backwardness, Tsarism as a block to dealing with it, and the mediating force of the church. And then there were other ways of mediating it. There was Tsarism tried to mediate this gap between where they wanted to be in backwardness and a more advanced society. Various revolutionary movements tried to mediate this. And this is something we're just going to see throughout Russian history. About the backwardness, in 1600, there was no, when you think of what's going on, it had gone on in Italy, Holland, and things about art and culture. Let's get to, in the 1600s, for instance, in England, in Russia, when all these people died, and when the court was living lavishly, compared to the rest of Europe, for instance, there was no portrait painting. This sounds trivial, but it's a big deal. Everybody else had more going on than Russia had. So this is one of the ways it's expressed, their backwardness. No portrait painting, no still lifes, no landscapes, no urban scenes, no paintings of historical events, no oil on canvas, no theaters, no universities, no poets, no dramatists, no Shakespeare, no philosophers, no scholars, no theologians, no concept of the arts, no political theory, because there didn't need to be any scholarly rationale of Tsarism. This is just amazing when you think of it. One of the things that Russians did have were these icons. And these icons were basically paintings of Christ and the apostles on wood, and they were like, especially among monks and the regular people, they were like tuning forks that helped you vibrate with the infinite to mediate that gap. And you can't, this goes into the notion of Holy Russia. There's this thing about the nature of the Orthodox Church and Tsarism that it's a profound aspect of the society that held it together and held it back at the same time. So just simplistic denunciations of religion are just really fruitless here. It's one of those times where you really, use an overused term, you need to have a dialectical understanding of this. But anyway, I think I want to talk a little bit about initially how the Tsarism came about, because you have to know what people were trying to transcend. These were not crazy people. They were not crazy for accepting the circumstances of their lives, and they were not crazy for struggling against it either. But the main thing you're going to notice here is that this sense of backwardness that Russia felt, not so much the peasantry, but the educated classes. A lot of the czars realized that they had to address this, that their own institution just couldn't be a lawless parasite on society. It had to at least have the appearance of being fair. And how they were never able to get it right. for a number of reasons. One of the things here is that the Bazaars, first of all, a big part of their way that they justified their position in society was that it was God ordained. And there's like this real mystical communion of Bazaar, like there's God the Father and then there's the Little Father. And believe me, the Little Father on earth is God present on earth. And just as God seems to deal with us with a certain degree of impunity, the Tsar can do that. But usually among the popular classes, it was the people that were around the Tsar that were blamed. The Little Father wasn't blamed because he was revered. Revered so much that he was viewed as a god. And but the Tsars actually began as tax collectors for the Mongol invaders. And it just seems so painfully prosaic when you realize how they came about. It was like warlords who the Mongol Empire didn't have the structural capacity to maintain control over their dominions, but they found locals that helped them do it. And the initial Tsars were drawn from this group of people. Before the Mongols invaded, however, there was a real flourishing in Kiev in Russia. There were Greek monks who came who brought the Cyrillic alphabet, which is why Russian looks real different from like English and French and Spanish. They brought the Greek Orthodox religion. They brought a certain respect for church and state. In Novgorod, in particular, this is something Russians are kind of proud of. In the 11th century, before the Mongols came, women were, according to foreign visitors, they couldn't believe that women seemed equal to men in Novgorod, which is in the far eastern part of Russia. There was a developed legal system. There was a sewage system and like streets and pavements that rivaled anything London had at the time. So socially and structurally, it was a pretty advanced society. What happened? Well, the Mongols happened. And this is it's really easy to, and there are revisionist histories that will minimize the influence of the Mongols, but it really did place a damper on Russian society from maybe growing at a pace that would have been closer to the Western world. Also, there's the famous story of Alexander Nevsky. It was around the same time. Nevsky is like part of the transcendent mythology of the Russian people. He was the 20-year-old prince of Novgorod, and the Teutonic Knights, part of a crusade to bring Catholicism to the heathen lands. And Nevsky, they had this battle on the ice, and Eisenstein did a famous film, I think in 1938, about it. And it was one of these patriotic rallying things. It was the same kind of patriotism kind of fired when people were willing to burn down Moscow. But basically, God intervened, and they were able to fight off the Teutonic Knights, but they weren't able to fight off the Mongols. The Mongol hordes lasted for 240 years, and most observers and Russians do believe that their society was fundamentally shaped by authoritarian system that, according to the people who were living in Eastern Russia, ancient Rus, Kiev, and Novgorod, and literally when the Mongols came in, they killed them. And it's ironic that one of the czars also went in and destroyed Novgorod, I think a couple hundred years later, and killed everybody the same way. But it's Kiev, and so there's this romanticized golden era of peace, of respect for authority, and God being present in the people and the destiny of the Russian people, of Holy Russia. This was disruptive. There are some of the czars you've heard of. We'll just go over some of them briefly, but Ivan the Terrible, from about the mid-1500s toward the end, he was there for almost 40 years. When I've read about him, he is routinely referred to as psychotic. He murdered his own son in a fit of rage, his young son. He did things like he expanded the territory, unified the state. But his reforms were sort of like more structural to maintaining power. He wiped out the nobility, replaced them with a secret police, who then were pretty much had to be wiped out. After his death in 1584, so much land had been turned over to certain nobles, peasants were having to pay 10 times as much in taxes as they did before. And, the taxes are the food. So this was just unbearable. And so it's like the arable land that was being cultivated shrunk by 70 or 80%. This was a huge social catastrophe. And then you have the 2 years where it's sub-zero weather, and then you have the plague, and my God, this country had a hard time.
What year was that volcano?
What?
The volcano with the
1600 in Peru.
On the dot?
Pardon me?
I said on the dot?
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. So, but then we have what came about as the Romanov Dynasty, which lasted for almost 300 years. That's the one that was finally overthrown in 1917. But I don't want you to think that people were just numbskulls and they put up with this. There were peasant uprisings. There was tension between. There's kind of a tension here between the spontaneity of the poor and an organized way of doing things. And this is another thing that the movement of the masses, there's these times, these events occur where people are in motion. And this tension between spontaneity and the organizing function of the state or some other mediating thing. This is a big idea when we get into Russian socialist political practice. We'll find that this tension within the Bolshevik Party and the Menshevik Party, the Marxists, and how they divide over certain issues. But the one part of the spontaneous uprisings, and these were just seemed like serendipitous events, and they were cruel and terrible, but they were profound expressions of discontent that finally had a chance to be expressed, because there was no legal outlet for dissent. There were no political parties. Dissent was not allowed. There were secret police everywhere. The first secret police had been organized by Ivan the Terrible in the 1500s. There was an incredible uprising in 1670 by Stanka Razin. Peasants, nomads, and religious rebels revolted against the Tsar, and Razin was kind of a charismatic figure. He claimed to be the true Tsar. They wanted to, and this was a big deal. There was like an army of 200,000 people. This is a huge, huge deal. They had a big effect on later Russian history because other czars didn't want this stuff to happen again. And people had lived through the time of troubles, as that time when it was below zero in the summer, and they lived through bad management by the previous czars. But there was a call for an end to exploitation. There was freedom and equality. Hundreds, maybe thousands of aristocrats and government officials were executed by this army. Food was distributed to common people. Finally, the next year, Razin was executed, hacked to death in Red Square. And supposedly his head rolled back and forth from his dismembered body, saying, "I have not died in vain." So this is a part of the cultural memory. And it sounds grotesque, but there's a...
Who was beheaded?
Razin, who was this rebel leader. But there is it beautifully encapsulates to the frustration that regular people felt at a variety of levels with the way that their lives were hemmed in by this regime that said it worked on behalf of God and that bled the country dry. 10% of the country were nobles and the Tsar's people, and the other 90% were regular people who served him. And one of the other Tsars here, and I don't want this to seem tedious, but it's kind of good to know about this stuff. Peter the Great in 1696 took over. He's considered the greatest Russian Tsar. And he, once again, he was educated like a Westerner would be educated, because he was going to be the future Tsar. He needed to have the most up-to-date information. He was 6'7", and he does seem to be a pretty brilliant man. He actually incognito. He's 6'7", incognito with a retinue of people, goes as an ordinary workman to England to see how ships are built. So they had to know it was him. But he was very sincere about wanting to bring, for both general reasons and also for reasons of personal survival, to protect his regime from being destroyed, figure out how the West was doing things firsthand. And he did a lot of modernizing things. He reformed government. He just thought the government, they'll overthrow you. We'll have another Razin event, because that was in real recent memory, just 25 years before, if we're just completely arbitrary. There have to be some rules, and we just can't put all of our own people into places. Let's have like the civil service where we actually have competent people instead of somebody's uncle who inherits a position. And this was all pretty rational stuff. He wanted to create a new capital city, St. Petersburg. This is where one of the contradictions comes in. St. Petersburg was built, it was a swamp. And they had to reclaim the swamp, and they built St. Petersburg, which is, I haven't been there, I understand it's like a beautiful Western European city. It was just the opposite of what Moscow was. And apparently hundreds of thousands of people who were made slaves died building it. Because when you're the Tsar, you can do anything to anyone. And he also tried to Europeanize Russia in a lot of ways. called it a great leap from darkness to light. He just basically wanted a regular state, but he wanted the nobility to start wearing Western clothes. He wanted them to stop wearing regular Russian smocks and everything. They had to shave their beards, and they had to learn how to speak French, which was the language of Europeans, the common currency of European civilization. And peasants and priests were didn't have to follow this rule. And, peasants were like 80% of the population, but these were the elite had to westernize, and they were forced to do it from above. This wasn't particularly popular, and there were a lot of parts about his changes that weren't popular. The Palace Guard had a revolt. Palace Guard plays a really important role in Russian history. They murdered czars and replaced them, and he was aware of this history, and he basically thwarted this rebellion. He personally took part in helping kill thousands of these people in St. Petersburg. These guards, they buried people up to their necks and then kind of desecrated them, and they hung the bodies on street corners, and it was several thousand. And so this is really intense stuff. But this is a sign where, once again, there's this tension between trying to catch up, doing it, having it enforced from the top down. And it turns out that the conditions for the survival of the Tsarist autocracy undermines the ability in the long run for a more advanced society to flower. And this just happens over and over again. In 1708 also, there was a peasant revolt, and it sounds a little bit like a Trump type revolt of the people. And there were priests and everything were a part of it, but Peter the Great just seemed like a foreigner. And the rebellion was put down quite cruelly. The level of serfdom already experienced by ordinary Russians was exacerbated. He died in 1725. He didn't leave plans for who was going to succeed him. That was, for somebody who was just so organized, it seems strange. But there were a lot of succession crises. Eventually, Catherine the Great. And she's once again, first of all, I want you to know that Catherine the Great did not die having sex with a horse. That's kind of like her enemies said it wasn't true. But she did have hundreds of liaisons with other men. But she was this brilliant woman. She was born in Germany, and she was married to one of the Tsar's family, who's going to be the heir to the throne. And then finally, when he became Tsar, within 2 or 3 years, I think he proved to be so incompetent that she convinced the palace guard to murder him and install her. So now there was the Romanov Dynasty, and I don't know if this is just popular historians. They say there's nobody with Russian blood for the next 200 years who was a Romanov. They were all Germans. And I don't know if this is anti-German stuff or what. But she started out as an intense reformer. She corresponded with Voltaire. They sent love letters back and forth. When Voltaire died, she wanted to take hold of all of his notes and everything because she had become a conservative and she didn't want those letters to get out in the public. But she was a great negotiator. She was willing to compromise. She relaxed censorship and encouraged education. She was kind of a philosopher on a throne. She was hailed almost universally among the educated progressive classes in Europe as like, oh my God, this is the future. This is an autocracy that's going to reform itself. In 1774, however, she came to 1762, I think, was when she took over. About 12 years later, there was the Pugachev rebellion, and it was like a national revolution again. Hundreds of thousands of people, the masses in motion, something that has kind of a spontaneous beginning, and then there are leaders that set it in a certain direction. It was, and I'm not totally sure about how spontaneous it was, in all honesty. But a lot of it was basically against her reforms. She was, they said she was a false czar. There were people who claimed to be her executed husband, who hadn't really died, who was the real czar. Pugachev was eventually beheaded. The rebellion was put down very brutally, and she decided that Russia was too large of a country to not have an autocratic rule, and you had to have one person rule. It had to be rule with an iron fist, and she basically gave up on all of these dreams she had that were, dreams of a lot of people. Actually, it's not just because there were rebellions doesn't mean that there weren't people that didn't welcome these changes. But she guaranteed all sorts of things to the nobility to win their allegiance back. No taxation, which of course meant that the regular people had to pay more. Their servitude grew even worse. And the gap in society widened between the elite and everyone else. Everything just got worse. We'll start wrapping this up pretty quickly because I want to get to the Russian opposition, which is fascinating. But there are certain things. Alexander the First, who came a while after Catherine when she died, and I think she died in 1794 or something. Anyway, Alexander the First came in as a czar after some turmoil, and there were big hopes that he was going to liberalize things, and he didn't. Then when he died, there's this, in 1825, all of those Russian soldiers, especially the officer corps that had gone were gaping like rubes at the Champs-Élysées in Paris. They staged a coup, which didn't work, in 1825, called the Decembrist Revolt, or the Decembrist Uprising, and it was put down. Then Alex the First was followed by Nicholas the First, who responded with huge violence. He was kind of a messianic religionist, I believe, and he had a far more anachronistic version of the Tsar compared to things that Catherine and even Peter the Great tried to do. But one of the things I want to mention is that the peasantry, we just talk about the peasantry, but the peasantry, it's Karl Marx referred to it as rural idiocy and everything. This is like 80% of the population. And these were just real people who scratched out a life under enormously difficult circumstances. Russians frequently, the whole family would live in a log house not much bigger than this. There were no tables. There were benches on the perimeter, which is where people sat, slept, ate, and there was a stove in the middle that didn't have a chimney because you couldn't let the heat get out. So in the winter, you were constantly being smoked out, and you had to bring your farm animals in there so they didn't die. I don't know how people ever had sex and reproduced. Under those conditions, I would be nervous. But maybe that's just me. But this was a really hard life. And at the time of Catherine the Great, there's 36 million Russians. 17 million of them were virtual slaves. And these were people with no recourse, who can't leave. And there were peasants and there were serfs. There were more serfs than there were peasants. And it's not an artificial distinction because the serfs were truly virtually slaves. The peasants were really poor people who had land, but they were not treated much better. And in 1861, Tsar Alexander II abolished serfdom. But
what year was it?
1861. But it was one of those things where it wasn't 20 acres and a mule. It wasn't even that good, which isn't great. They didn't get any land. They had to pay for the land, and you became a debtor. And the nobles were reimbursed for the land that was given to the former serfs by the Tsar. And so all the right people were looked after, and the regular people once again got the bad end of the stick. It also created a huge social cleavage because some of the more prosperous peasantry became what's called kulaks, and they were proto-capitalists. And one of the things about the peasant society, there were the village communes. And the communes were organizations usually run by the better off members of the village. But at the same time, they were, there's that kind of informal social solidarity that goes on between people when you watch out for your own. But there were structural aspects as a part of the commune, the mirror they called it, that budding revolutionaries thought, wow, this could be the beginning of this socialism thing we've heard about. And we don't even have to pass through capitalism because within 80% of the country, there's this tradition of a kind of semi-collectivism going on here. And this is almost like a radical version of Holy Russia, this destiny of Russia to change the world. And but with the abolition of serfdom, once again, things still didn't turn out very well. And 1881, I'm not sure, I might have got the wrong czar yes. Pardon me?
Oh, we're about there time-wise.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's get in, then do we want to, let's go over the opposition. Okay, let's go over the opposition real quick. Basically Alexander II was assassinated.
When?
They tried at 1881. They tried to kill him several times. They finally blew him up and blew his legs off, and he died. And the people who did it were a terrorist group, so-called. There were the opposition in Russia was divided between what we call populists, social revolutionaries, the Marxists and the liberals. The populists were educated, better off people who sincerely in their hearts wanted to help the peasantry. In 1874, thousands of them went into the countryside, tried to act like peasants. They didn't fit in. They had no idea of how out of their element they were. They ended up like within 6 months, 2,000 of them were there. 1,600 were turned into the police and jailed. The populists then were transformed into two groups. The social revolutionaries, which were agriculturally based, and they believed in kind of an agrarian socialism. And then there were the terrorist group, the Narodnya Volia, the People's Will, and they specialized in assassinating people. Assassinated thousands of Tsar's officials because they were so what I tried to basically show you is that Tsardom would not go away. It was you couldn't live with it. It had to be destroyed violently. So they were hoping that if you killed individual members that were keeping the social structure up, that it would fall. And that didn't work. The social revolutionaries believed that there was a socialist possibility in the countryside. Then there were the Marxists, and that's where the Bolsheviks came from. So if we don't have much time, maybe this is what I'm going to have to do for the second one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's also, in preparation for the next one. So I did forget to lead off with that, but if you've been following the Facebook event, you might have saw that this became part 1 of 2.
Yeah.
And the other one is in 3 weeks, and it would be useful to feed the event every few days with some factoids,
sure,
and resources and things like that. And I know if videos and articles and anything like that. I know I'll want to be engrossing myself in all of that. So,
well, basically, to wrap it up, there was a variety of opposition arose because there was a crying need for society to advance. It could not advance under Tsardom, which was the structural block that kept it from happening. There were a lot of opposition responses to it. There was, once again, the populists. There were the agrarian-based socialists in the cities. There were the Marxists who ended up splitting. And then there were the liberal capitalists who were basically kind of chicken shit about everything and would always defer to the Tsar if they got paid. And so you couldn't depend upon the bourgeoisie to make the bourgeois revolution. And so socialist revolutionaries were forced to do what the bourgeoisie wouldn't do on its own. And maybe talking all about Marxism and everything next week. This is probably as a more rational place to stop off. I guess the main thing that I want to emphasize is that these people were not crazy. Even the Tsars, they weren't evil. This is a situation that is directly transmitted from the past. Everybody experiences a feeling of thrownness in the situation. They're responding to things they didn't create. And the opposition to Tsardom was profound. It was violent, and it was completely to be expected and reasonable. And in the end, it ended up in a violent revolution that nobody expected, but everybody expected at the same time. So there you go. I guess I put more time on the Bazaars than I thought I would, but I do think you need to be aware of that, because you can't understand the passion of the opposition unless you understand just by saying, yeah, it's just not good enough, and what they were up against. And you can also at the same time that they were the revolutionaries were affected by the society they lived in, and they played by its rules, and its rules were not pretty. So
I'm really glad you decided to break it into two, so you could give us all of this background, because
I didn't think
you don't normally get the
that the
background,
Tsarist period would take up so much time.
I will just say this. We're going to figure out more bearable conditions for sitting and talking, and that might be outside in a shady area. We're guessing it probably is, and so we're going to move it out there. We don't have anyone who's currently online with us, though we have a lot of people who want to watch this, including Sky, who wasn't able to be here. So goodbye online portion, goodbye recorded portion. If you missed the Q&A and you're curious about what happens with that, just ask people who are here. Bye.